So this lesson will deal with modernization amongst the Sephardim in Greece in the 19th and 20th centuries. The watershed of modernization for the Sephardim was mid-19th century European modernization. The Jews, unlike in Northern Europe, didn't have to be liberated from ghettos, didn't have to be liberated politically. The Jews already had rights. They had more rights in the 19th century from parallel Ottoman reforms. But the Jews modernized through the entrance of foreign language schools and ultimately what was called the Alliance Israélite Universelle Jewish-French school system. The Alliance was started by someone named Narcisse Levin about 1860 in Paris. Paris then was the world Jewish power. And there were a lot of wealthy Jews like the Rothschilds, Baron de Hirsch, and Montefiore in London, and Judo Turo from New Orleans, who were benefactors for the Jewish world. And the Jews, they were essentially Ottoman subjects, but the Ottoman Empire at this point was very neglected. They also wanted to upgrade themselves. They were influenced by Western European education. So originally there were French schools. There were English schools, English Protestant missionary schools, German schools. Then the Alliance Israélite Universelle began a school system for Jewish children to become westernized in Eastern Europe and all throughout the Mediterranean and Ottoman Empire, and to learn the ideals of the French Revolution, of égalité, fraternité, liberté, of equality, justice, liberty, etc., etc. So through the Alliance Israélite Universelle school system, which was financed from France initially, the Jews got exposure to history, to geography, to literature. It created a middle class. It created people who became, aside from the rabbis, who could read and write, and they could also not only read and write in the local Judeo-Spanish language and in the print script, etc., and in the typescript, but they could read now, let's say, French. They could read Latin letters. They could learn to write. They could learn literature. They learned history. They learned theater. They learned they learned about modern music. So this also, not only did the Alliance establish school systems, it was a backbone for Jewish communities for when they had earthquakes and fires and they needed to rebuild a synagogue or put walls around a cemetery, but it was an educational source which helped the Jews advance socially and economically. So the Jews also created a vibrant secular Sephardic culture from this. Now in modernization, so you have the Alliance, and then you have the beginning of Judeo-Spanish theater, the beginning of Judeo-Spanish music, minstrels, printed music. The most famous in Salonika was Yaakov Yonah, who would have public concerts on streets and in clubs, and then he would put out his songs in Judeo-Spanish Rashi-like typescript, and people would buy it. And that's how he made a living. And you had Judeo-Spanish theater in Salonika and Istanbul, just like you had Yiddish theater in New York or in Vilna. And at first, though, the Alliance was a secularizing institution. Most of the rabbis objected. They objected because the children weren't learning Talmud in the traditional subjects, the traditional, say, rabbinic interpretations, etc., etc. But what happened was the Alliance, like for example in Salonika, had 8 schools, 6,000 students, until basically World War I. It existed later on, but there were changes in Greece, and there was a dictatorship, and so it came to an end in the Ottoman Empire and in the Mediterranean basin because the Alliance couldn't finance all these schools. The local communities couldn't finance all these schools for teachers' salaries. The Alliance also did have occupational education. So for Jews learned trades through the Alliance. Women learned sewing and the traditional topics which aren't popular anymore, like home economics. But in Salonika, because of the modernization and the factories, the Jews advanced. And of course, the local Greek Orthodox population advanced also. The Jews had many factories in Salonika for bricks, for flour, mills, etc., etc. And they were big importers, exporters. But the thing was that these factories also advanced the tobacco trade. This region was big for tobacco growing. Also in the region, entrepreneurs like Montefiore and Baron Hirsch established railroads between various points, and this advanced populations. Also, these pioneers in the Alliance Israélite Universelle and foreign school systems, like Joseph Nechama, who was a secularist, he was also a banker. He wasn't just the principal of the Alliance schools in Salonika. Or there was Moïse Alatini, who was from a Livorno family of these Francos, who I told you about, but he was an industrialist, and he put his emphasis and money on education through the Alliance schools. They also revitalized the antiquated Talmud Torah, which I talked to you about before. And so Salonika became a haven. It also became a new economic haven. After Sabbatianism and a whole economic abyss in the end of the 17th and 18th centuries, this was an economic revival. It was a cultural revival, it was an intellectual revival, and it was an industrial revival. So also Salonika had the tobacco factories and sorting factories. So you had a new working class of organized, like 6,000 Jewish workers who were very secular. That we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But this is all part of the modernization process. And until now, they still were part of the Ottoman system, and they're part of the reforms, but everything is cut off because Abdul Hamid doesn't want, in the end, political reforms.